In the notes of his 1922 poem, The Wasteland, T.S. Eliot mentions a certain book that served as inspiration for this passage. He admits that he doesn't remember the name of the book, but found the story itself to be unforgettable. He says the following about the unnamed book. It was related that the party of explorers, at the extremity of their own strength, had the constant delusion that there was one more member than could actually be counted. Eliot could have only been referring to the novel South, by Sir Ernest Shackleton, published 3 years before The Wasteland. The novel is Shackleton's first-person account of his crew's 1914 voyage to Antarctica, where he brought along a team of 27 scientists and adventurers in hopes to become the first group to explore the mysterious and isolated continent. But dreams of adventure quickly dissolved into a very real battle against the elements. As their ship, the Endurance, entered the Weddell Sea, water began to freeze around them, trapping the vessel in a block of ice that refused to be steered. As the ship drifted far off course, the men began to hear a sound from their worst nightmares. It was the sound of wood splintering as the grip of the ice tightened around the ship. As icy water began to flood the boat, the men were forced to grab what they could and climb onto the ice. There, they watched their only safe haven from the cold sink into the depths of the sea. Thankfully, several smaller boats were recovered from the ship, and the 28 men were able to migrate to Elephant Island, about 150 miles north of Antarctica, and only slightly more safe than a drifting slab of ice. The island was brutal, as the men had no effective means to hunt the few creatures that inhabited it, and there was little to gather in the stubborn soil beneath the snow. Knowing they wouldn't last long in these conditions, Shackleton recruited 5 men to journey north to South Georgia, about 800 miles away, to get help from the crew at the whaling station. The journey had a few close calls, such as a near capsize, but the men eventually reached South Georgia after 17 days at sea. Although their safe arrival was a miracle, their journey was far from over. There was still a mountain range standing between them and the station, and Shackleton decided to bring only 2 men with him for the arduous hike ahead, through a foreign, unforgiving terrain. For Shackleton, and his companions Frank Worsley and Tom Crean, this journey was their last chance to save the lives of the friends they left behind, and feeling the effects of starvation and exhaustion, the men likely experienced great mental distress as they pushed forward through the snow, not knowing if they would be able to make it through the night. Yet over the course of a day and a half's march, they stumbled upon the whaling station and were able to send for help, and eventually saw every member of the Endurance recovered alive. It's miraculous that this story didn't have a much darker ending. Some would say it was pure grit that pushed these men along to the end of their journey, but the men themselves tell a slightly different story. When I look back at those days, Shackleton recalled years later, I have no doubt that Providence guided us, not only across those snowfields, but across the storm-wide sea that separated Elephant Island from our landing place on South Georgia. I know that during that long and racking march of 36 hours over the unnamed mountains and glaciers of South Georgia, it seemed to me often that we were 4, not 3. I said nothing to my companions on the point, but afterwards, Worsley said to me, "Boss, I had a curious feeling on the march that there was another person with us." Crean confessed to the same idea. One feels the dearth of human words, the roughness of mortal speech, in trying to describe things intangible, but a record of our journeys would be incomplete without a reference to a subject very near to our hearts. The 3 men, without mentioning it to each other, sensed another presence with them in the mountains, seemingly guiding them towards safety. This account is now cited as the first recorded instance of third man syndrome, a phenomenon in which a guardian of sorts is seen or sensed by a person in a dangerous situation, and which typically leaves when safety or rescue are in sight. While Shackleton was the first to write about this experience, reports began to emerge in the years after its publication that confirm this presence has been felt far beyond the reaches of South Georgia. Today, we'll be examining 5 of these reports, beginning with the man that was almost the first to conquer Mount Everest. Sometime in 1933, veteran climber Frank Smythe joined a group determined to be the first to scale Everest. The men seemed to have a strong start, but as their march continued, and the air seemed to become thinner with every step, they began to turn back one by one. This continued until Smythe was the only one left, pushing beyond all boundaries his body could endure. Without supplemental oxygen, Smythe was able to make it within 1,000 feet of the peak of Everest before he realized his body could go no further. Smythe weakly turned around and began his journey back to base camp, but began to experience something strange. In his own words, "All the time that I was climbing alone, I had a strong feeling that I was accompanied by a second person. The feeling was so strong that it completely eliminated all loneliness I might have otherwise felt. This feeling of companionship felt so real that at one point Smythe broke off a piece of his mint cake to offer it to the presents, and was actually surprised that there was no one to accept it. He continued the difficult hike down the mountain, all the while feeling as if another was walking beside him, until eventually his group's camp was in sight. Only then, he reported, did it feel as if the presence had left his side, and he walked the rest of the way to safety, feeling truly alone." In 1953, Herman Buhl set out to become the first person to climb Nanga Parbat, a mountain in the Himalayas standing at almost 27,000 feet. For reference, Mount Everest stands at about 29,000 feet. He embarked on this journey alone and climbed for 17 hours before reaching the mountain's summit. Although the journey upwards had been difficult, it was the descent that presented the biggest challenge of all. Somewhere along his journey, he had lost his ice axe, and the effects of oxygen deprivation and exhaustion were beginning to debilitate him. Yet miraculously, Buhl was able to make it back down the mountain to his camp. When speaking of this experience, he was quoted as saying, "During those hours of extreme tension, I had an extraordinary feeling that I was not alone. I had a partner with me, looking after me, taking care of me, belaying me. I knew it was imagination, but the feeling persisted. Whether this mysterious partner was an angel or just a hallucination, its presence provided the comfort and companionship Buhl needed to make it off the mountain that day, a sentiment shared by many who have experienced the third man in times of need." In 1895, experienced sailor Joshua Slocum was on track to become the first man to sail around the world completely alone. Slocum stopped in several different countries during his voyage, with one of his first stops being in the Azores, a small string of islands off the coast of Portugal. Here, he was celebrated by the locals and given gifts of cheese and fruit. As his ship drifted away from the islands, he couldn't help but try some of the decadent food he was given. Slocum began eating the cheese and fruit, and could not stop from gorging himself on the rich food. Although the food was delicious, he soon began to feel strange. In terror, he realized he had gotten food poisoning and was left writhing on the cabin floor in pain. With almost comedic timing, the ship began to be tossed by a strong wind, a warning of the vicious storm brewing on the horizon. Slocum did what he could in his state to prepare the ship for the storm, but passed out before he could complete all of his tasks. When Slocum finally came to, this was his account of what he saw. "To my amazement, I saw a tall man at the helm. He would have been taken for a pirate in any part of the world. 'Señor,' said he, doffing his cap, 'I have come to do you no harm,' and a smile, the faintest in the world, but still a smile, played on his face, which seemed not unkind when he spoke. 'I have come to do you no harm. I am one of Columbus's crew,' he continued. 'I am the pilot of the Pinta come to aid you. "Lie quiet, Senor Captain," he added, "and I will guide your ship tonight." Slocum drifted out of consciousness some time after this encounter, but when he came to again, saw no more dark skies and no more of his companion. The ship was right on course, having traveled 90 miles through the night. The Pinta, mentioned by the mysterious man, was the fastest of Christopher Columbus's 3 ships on his 1492 voyages to the New World, about 400 years prior. Slocum would recover from his illness, and after 3 years, complete his circumnavigation of the Earth. In 1900, he would go on to publish his account of the journey in his novel, Sailing Alone Around the World, which became an international bestseller. Slocum was a beloved figure among adventurers and sailors alike, and he showed no signs of slowing down. 9 years after the publication of his novel, he set off for the West Indies in the same ship that had carried him around the world. From what we know, he never reached the West Indies, and Slocum was never seen or heard from again. On May 20th, 1927, Charles Lindbergh set off from New York City in his plane en route to Paris, France, hoping to become the first person to fly non-stop across the Atlantic, completely alone. Lindbergh encountered many issues on his historic flight, including violent lightning and a thick fog obscuring his view. But around 24 hours into his journey, sleep deprivation posed the biggest threat to his mission. But as he felt his eyelids become heavier and heavier with every passing minute, he began to sense many other people inside the plane with him. In his own words, "They were discussing problems of my navigation, reassuring me, giving me messages of importance unattainable in ordinary life. These spirits have no rigid bodies, yet they remain human in outline and form. They're neither intruders nor strangers. It's more like a gathering of friends and family after years of separation, as though I'd known all of them before in some past life." Rather than alarming him, these presences seemed to bring Lindbergh comfort and motivation to push through to the end of his journey, and on May 21st, 1927, he landed in Paris. Our final story is one that doesn't exactly qualify as a case of third man syndrome, because the so-called third man was not seen or sensed by the 2 men in our story. However, I thought it was still important to include. Sometime in the first half of the 20th century, Robert Ekbal and Ed Carlson worked as missionaries in rural Tibet. The men rode horses to get from one place to another, and carried weapons with them because of the abundance of bandits and thieves that preyed on travelers. One day, while the men were traveling through the mountains, they spotted a much larger group of men on horseback barreling towards them. The men were frozen, as they realized they might soon have to fight for their lives. But suddenly, the group slowed to a stop and quickly retreated. Ekval and Carlson were confused, but relieved that they were able to avoid a conflict. Later on, Ekval would tell a story about running into one of these bandits. Ekval allegedly asked the man why they retreated when they could have easily overtaken his group of 2. "We weren't afraid of you," the man said. "We weren't afraid of your friend." "But who is that shining one with you?" According to this man, the sight of a third on horseback, whose skin appeared to emanate light, was enough to ward off an attack on Ekval and Carlson. The 2 men had neither seen nor sensed this shining one the bandits spoke of. Pictured here is an artistic rendering of what the bandits supposedly saw. In researching the third man phenomenon, I was overwhelmed with the sheer number of stories like the ones we looked into today. It seems that this experience of sensing another when there is none is profoundly human. Some have argued that this phenomenon occurs because we are social creatures, and that our subconscious mind will literally create a companion to help us cope with a challenging situation. According to one study, up to 65% of children 7 years old and younger have had an imaginary friend. We know that this phenomenon is normal, so it could be said the third man experience is a natural extension of it when our minds revert to a more vulnerable, childlike state. It has also been argued that the third man is simply a hallucination brought on by starvation, dehydration, exhaustion, sickness, or mental distress. But some believe their encounters to be of a divine nature. Guardian angel is a title we often see attributed to the third man figure, and for good reason. When one is in their most dire time of need, the third man can be seen as a beacon of hope, a guide towards the light, a comfort amidst the sorrow. Like all of these theories, it cannot be proven or disproven that this is the case. If you're interested in learning more about the possible scientific explanations behind these encounters, I highly recommend reading The Third Man Factor: Surviving the Impossible by John Geiger. The author also made an online forum for people to share their own third man experiences, so I'll be attaching links to both of those in the description. Finally, if you have experienced third man syndrome firsthand, I would love to hear your story in the comments below, as well as whether or not you believe this experience to have been supernatural. And of course, thank you so much for watching this video, and until next time, stay safe out there.